Okay, guys, welcome back to part two of my introduction and bookshelf tour. Again, I'm going to be talking about the books that I cannot easily replace today, the ones that are really special and, you know, can't find them online in digital form. And in many cases, I can't find them online in physical form either. So basically, this is all I got. All right, so let's get started really quickly. No long introductions this time around. Again, my name is John, in case you missed it last time. But first book up, this here is Anthology of ASEAN Literatures, Epics of the Philippines. So ASEAN, if you don't know, is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's a international organization along the same lines as like the European Union or the African Union or something like that, although it is a bit looser than the European Union and a bit closer than the African Union. And now they have every country in Southeast Asia is part of it, basically. But at the time it was founded back in I believe it was in the 80s that it was founded, maybe a little bit earlier. Um, no, it must have been a little bit earlier. Anyway, at the time it was founded, it was an anti-communist pact. So at that time, it was limited to the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. Later, they allowed in the communist countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Still, they allowed in the very underdeveloped, by comparison, Myanmar or Burma. But at the time that this book was published, they were still sort of the anti-communist bloc of Southeast Asia. And in the 1980s, they published a series of books to promote the traditional literature of the region. So selections were made by each member state, and they were published here. And I have seen the Indonesia volume, or one of the Indonesia volumes. I believe that each country had two. But at the time, I was backpacking in Thailand, and I frankly just did not have enough room in my backpack for any more books. I'd already bought so many. This is one of the ones that I got there. I've been to the Philippines, but I bought this in Thailand, not the Philippines, unfortunately. Anyway, so this is a collection of oral epics from Philippine indigenous people, the Aliguyon, Lamang, Laba, Dongon, Agyu, and Sandayo peoples. Um, they are fascinating. It's oral epic poetry. It's actually bilingual. You can see here we have the local language and English. I believe it's bilingual in the language of the specific tribes, not in Filipino, which is kind of an interesting choice given the nature of this as essentially nationalistic propaganda. But I think it's really interesting. This was published in 1986, and yeah, I'm really glad to have it. And I haven't seen. I take that back. I have seen one copy of this on Amazon, but it costs like several $100s to order. So I think this is pretty much going to be it for me. Oh, sorry, I said 1986. It was 1983. My mistake. But yeah, Epics of the Philippines. Interesting book. Okay. Up next is the Anthology of Islamic Literature, edited by James Kritzeck for Pelican. Um, this one, it's not so much that it's rare or unusual or unique. It's just kind of old, and it's been supplanted, I'm sure, by any number of other compilations or anthologies, I should say. Um, but for what it is, it's definitely worthwhile. Again, I picked this up at a used bookstore, of course, and it's let's see, when was it published? Yeah, it was published in 1964, so it is quite an old book. Um, and as a result, it does have some interesting choices in terms of translation selection here. There's a lot of the old-fashioned style of translating non-Western literature in which everything is made to sound like the King James Version of the Bible, which I find a little bit unfortunate. I understand why they did it because, of course, the King James Version of the Bible has a lot of gravitas and it sounds good. It sounds uh, deep and resonant and holy and all of the things that you want. And so, if you're going to translate, for example, the Meccan chapters of the Quran, it makes sense that you would want to parallel that. But I don't think it's really necessary. And even if you're reading the Bible, quite frankly, I don't think the King James Version is the best translation there is. It's a beautiful translation. It's something that people should read regardless of their religious persuasion because it's you know such a part of the literary culture of English. But if you want to understand the text, there are other better translations out there, and the same is true for the book for the works in this book. If you want to understand um, you know any of these texts, whether it's the Quranic verses or the poems of Hafiz or the writings of Ibn Khaldun or anything like that, there are better, more modern translations available. But for what it's worth, it's pretty good. It's entertaining, at least. Okay. Up next, we have Bali, Sekala, and Niskala, Essays on Religion, Ritual, and Art by Fred B. Eiseman Jr. This is a really interesting work of kind of amateur anthropology and amateur religious studies by a Westerner who lived in Bali as an expat for many, many years. And he spent 28 years living on the island and really immersed himself in the religion, the culture, everything about it. And even though it is somewhat of an amateur ethnography, um, it's definitely worthwhile. And if you are going to Bali and you are interested in doing more than just laying on the beach, this is worth picking up because it does give you some insight into Balinese Hinduism, which is it gets a lot of press as one of the few non-Muslim islands in Indonesia, but when people say Hindu in Bali, it's not the same as the Hinduism of India. There is a very distinct Balinese flavor to it that it's completely unique. And yeah, if you want to have some idea of that, pick it up. It's good. Okay. Up next, Bandit Saints of Java by George Quinn. How Java's eccentric saints are challenging fundamentalist Islam in modern Indonesia. This is a really interesting book too, mostly because I think a lot of Westerners have this idea of Islam as a monolithic thing. And specifically, a lot of the stereotypes about Islam uh, derive from things like the Wahhabi or Salafi branches, which, you know, those are important, those are influential, those cannot be ignored, but they're only one branch. And there's a lot more to it than just that. And what this does is it really goes deep into traditionalist Islam in Indonesia, which you may hear the word traditionalist and think fundamentalist, but it could not be more opposite. The traditionalist Islam in the sense of it integrates with folk religion and there's a lot of kind of carryover between the pre-Islamic traditions of the island of Java and the way Islam is practiced in the rural areas of the country even today, and even in the big cities as well. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's especially prevalent in rural areas of Java and other places where conversion happened early and was a lot more syncretic than places like, for example, Aceh in northern Sumatra, where it's much more akin to the Islam of the Gulf. This is not that. This is a unique, a unique tradition of Islam that I think is really fascinating, and I really do recommend everyone who goes to Indonesia, don't just go to Bali. Go to Java. Spend your time in Java. That's where the heart of the country is. It's good. Okay. Right, here we have Burmese Monk's Tales by Mong Tin Ang. Again, I'm certain that I'm mispronouncing his name. Um, I mentioned him in my first video, and this is another one of his works. He again, it's a bootleg copy of a university press book, in this case, a 1966 Columbia University press book. Again, it's very cheaply made, printed in the back alley of Yangon somewhere on basically just printer paper. But, it's interesting. And this one is a lot more of a collection of folk tales than a scholarly text. There is some scholarly commentary on it, but it's mostly just the folk tales. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, this is a good place to look. Here we have The Classic of Mountains and Seas. So The Classic of Mountains and Seas is it's a main source of Chinese mythology. Essentially, it's a almost an encyclopedic text about pre-modern China's conception of the natural world and the animals and mythical creatures and gods and spirits that inhabited that natural world, and the landscape of mountains, seas, rivers that traversed it. And when we say mountains and seas, we're not necessarily talking about actual physical places. A lot of these are mythical locations that nevertheless were considered to be real and important places in the cosmology of pre-modern China. So it's an interesting book. Again, especially if you're into folklore, mythology, things like that. This is a good place to look for Chinese folklore and mythology. All right, here we have Cigarette Girl by Rati Kumala. Rati Kumala is a Indonesian author, and this is kind of a romance novel, honestly. It's very much a love story, but it's not just a love story. It's got a little bit more to it than that. But yeah, it's not bad. Hmm. Well, I say not bad like that, and you're going to think it's terrible. It's just not really my style. If you're interested in this kind of thing, uh, it's probably a good place to go if you're looking to get an Indonesian voice writing a romantic or historical fiction novel. But it's just not really the genre that I gravitate to. So for me, it's interesting to hear the voice, but not necessarily my kind of thing. But still, definitely worth it if you're interested in that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, here we have Deep Rivers by Jose Maria Arguedas. Arguedas was a Peruvian author. I haven't actually read this book. I'm currently reading another book I have by him, which I'll be mentioning a little bit later. But he was what was called an Indianist or an indigenous author, although he never really liked that term. And he was very much focused on um, representing the Quechua and Aymara speaking indigenous people of the high Andes and the plateaus and of Peru. Um, and this book, from what I understand, is about a an indigenous person or actually a mixed race boy who joins a monastery at the age of 14, and just his life kind of coming to terms with both the modern Peruvian world and the old indigenous world. Again, I haven't read it yet, but I do enjoy his work. I'm reading Yawar Fiesta by him now, and it's pretty good. There are a few issues I think more with the translation than with his original, but well, we can see. Okay. We have Durians Are Not the Only Fruit, Notes from the Tropics by Wong Yun-hwa. Uh, Durian, if you don't know, is the huge fruit. It's kind of an ugly greenish yellow color, and it's got big spikes. And when you crack it open, it smells like rotting feet, basically. A lot of people hate it. I personally really like it, but that's neither here nor there. What this is, it's a collection of essays about growing up uh, on rubber plantations in rural Malaya, which is the mainland portion of Malaysia. Wang Yunhua is a ethnically Chinese Malaysian author who I believe now lives in Singapore. And he kind of grew up in both countries, Malaysia and Singapore, and always saw himself as a native of both countries. So these essays are really beautiful. Well, they're really beautiful representations of the people, the landscape, the nature, everything about that whole region, Malaysia, Singapore, a little bit into Indonesia as well, but mostly just Malaysia and Singapore. And if you are ever traveling in that region, you might see this copy or this book at a used bookstore or, well, a new bookstore as well. Pick it up. It's a nice travel read. I'll say that. Okay. Here we have Empire of Glass by Caitlin Solomon. I think that's how you would pronounce her name. So Caitlin Solomon is an American writer. This one is about a Chinese American teenager who goes to stay with a Chinese family and is kind of brought into the the life and history of modern China. And as you can imagine, this is a really kind of an interesting book about kind of the clash of those two cultures and things like that. I have not finished it. I started it and didn't quite get halfway through, to be honest. I do plan on coming back to it eventually, as I do with all of these. That's actually my quarantine reading goal, is to read everything that I have a hard copy of. I don't know if that's going to be possible, but for now, this one is it's kind of an interesting one, and it's sort of calling to me. Okay. Uh, we have Essays on Thailand by Tanapol Chadchaidi. These, uh, yeah, it's fine. It's really basic introductory essays, um, bilingual in both Thai and English. I believe this was intended more as a language primer than anything else. But it's interesting to see, and some of the material and some of the information in it is actually quite interesting. But as I said, I think it's more of a language primer than anything else. So it's not so interesting just as something to read. But yeah, it's all right. where else am I gonna get it except for Bangkok, right? Okay. And here we have The Glass Palace Chronicle of the Kings of Myanmar. You may have heard The Glass Palace by Amitav Ghosh. That's a kind of modernized novel loosely based on this book. This is the actual Burmese um, chronicle of the kings of the country in the age before colonialism. And as such, it is very interesting from a historical standpoint, perhaps a bit difficult to read if you're not used to non-Western historiography. But for me, this is fascinating. Um, this one was actually this one was also printed in Myanmar, but it's not a cheap bootleg. It's an actual like hardbound, uh, nice printed book. But yeah, this one actually, I believe it was a limited edition published for the 120th birthday of the translator. So it's kind of cool. Um, yeah, it's cool. I got it at a used bookshop in Chiang Rai, Thailand. But yeah, it's cool. It's nice. Okay. All right. Here we have Got Singapore: Bits and Pieces from a Dot in the World by Richard Lim. Uh, these are essays. I believe Richard Lim is Richard Lim is a columnist for the Straits Times, one of the major English language newspapers in Singapore, and this is a collection of his essays. Haven't read it yet, but I think Singapore is a really interesting country and a really interesting city. So I'm definitely looking forward to this one because I want to learn more about this tiny little, fantastically multicultural island that it just gets so overshadowed by its larger neighbors that it's an endlessly fascinating place. Okay. All right. Next we have Harvesting the Storm by John Waromi, a fable from the shores of West Papua. So John Waromi, as the subtitle, A Fable from the Shores of West Papua should tell you, he is a Papuan author from West Papua, which is a province of Indonesia, but it's one that is very culturally distinct, closely tied to Papua New Guinea, and has and currently is having a lot of issues with uh, independence movements and things and rebellion, things like that. So I have never been to West Papua. I got this in Indonesia. So the fact that they're selling this book in the rest of Indonesia probably indicates that it's not really a pro-independence author, but who knows? It could be. I don't really know. But this is um, it's kind of a fable, as the subtitle implies, uh, where most of the characters are animals, and very much in the Aesop's fable tradition of talking animals that act like humans. Um, it's an interesting little book. Definitely a fun read. Okay. Then we have History of Lanna by Saraswati Ongsakul. So Lanna is or was a kingdom in northern Thailand centered around what's the city of Chiang Mai, and this is, I believe, the first English language history of Lanna to be published. It was originally published in Thai, of course, but it's been translated now. And yeah, if you are interested in the history of Southeast Asia, you're probably not going to find much else about northern Thailand. without actually diving into learning the languages of the region. So barring that, got to go for this one. Very interesting. And here we have History of Timor-Leste by Frédéric Guy Durand. Originally written in French, but this one is, of course, published or translated into English. So Timor-Leste is one of the newest countries in the world. I believe only South Sudan has gotten its independence since then, and as such, we don't really get a lot of the history of the country. So that's why I picked this one up. This is really just it's a textbook. So if you're not taking a class on it, this is probably not going to be the most fun book in the world to read. But I want to know more about Timor-Leste, this sort of weird Catholic half island that speaks Portuguese as well as the local languages. It's an interesting place, and I always want to know more. But anyway, okay, here's Jungle Book, Thailand's Politics, Moral Panic and Plunder, 1996 to 2008, selected columns by Chang Noi. Chang Noi is a pen name of a columnist for The Nation, which is a newspaper in Bangkok. And as the name implies, this is 64 articles talking about the politics and society in Thailand in the late 90s and through the 2000s. So very specialized topic if you're not from Thailand. But if you are interested in that kind of information, this is an interesting book. There's a lot of interesting essays in here. It's some wild stuff about Thai politics, I gotta say. Okay. Here, The Last Cannibals, A South American Oral History by Ellen B. Basso. I picked this one up in Peru, but it actually takes place in Brazil. I say takes place. This is an academic text. It is kind of a monograph on storytelling traditions in the Upper Xingu region of Brazil, which is a very indigenous region of Brazil that was never fully conquered. And even up to today, it's still mostly an indigenous society. And what I liked about this, I bought it thinking it was just going to be an academic monograph. And a large part of it is. But as it turns out, part of that academic monograph is including fully rendered, fully rendered written down versions of the stories that are told by the local indigenous people in Upper Xingu region or Alto Xingu region. And what's interesting about that is that these cultures have completely different concepts of what is important in storytelling. So things that you or I might think of as impossibly dull and repetitive and almost mind-numbing, to the people telling the stories, that's the key point in the story. And it's just interesting to read these stories and see this radically different interpretation of what makes a story interesting, what makes a story good, what makes a story worthwhile. So, came for the academic side, stayed for the storytelling side. Very much worth the ride. It's a good book. Yeah. Okay, here we have Mongolian Shamanism by Professor Purav Otgoni and Purvi Gurbardarin. This one was published in Mongolia itself, in Ulaanbaatar, immediately after the fall of the communist regime. And it's kind of an amateurish frankly, amateurish academic text about Mongolian shamanism and its interactions with Buddhism and its status as an independent religion. It's really interesting, mainly because it is coming from the point of view of someone who, while not necessarily part of the shamanistic tradition, because he was, he was a communist era or post-communist era Mongolian academic, so he wasn't, actually a shaman. He had the same kind of cultural background and therefore was able to appreciate the context that this tradition existed in. So although the academics are not exactly what you might want from a true academic source, but this is very valuable and very interesting reading. Okay. All right. Here we have Immortal Flower by Han Suyin. Han Suyin was a Chinese author who wrote. Well, I have to say first off that I have not yet read this one. I just picked it up a couple of months ago, actually. In January, I took my Chinese New Year festival holiday. I went to Myanmar, and while I was in Myanmar, things started locking down in China. So I almost didn't get back in. But while I was there, picked up this book from a street vendor or street seller, and it looks interesting. Um, I'm not 100% sure if this is actually a memoir or if it's fictionalized into a novel, but I'm looking forward to it. This is kind of it takes place during the Chinese Civil War, and Han Suyin really did live through that. So her perspective on that story is going to be interesting to read. We have My Journey from Paris to Java by Honoré de Balzac. Now, if you are not aware, Honoré de Balzac never went to Java. This is 100% a work of imagination, and that's kind of why it's interesting. It's you know, it's what a French person in the 19th century thought Java would be, even though he never actually went there. So, if you're willing to give things the benefit of the doubt, it's worth a look. It's interesting. Maybe not. Don't use it as a source. Just read it as a work of fantasy, basically. Okay. And here we have The People's War by Israel Epstein, or Epstein, I'm not sure. Israel Epstein he was an American journalist who he kind of he was a war correspondent during World War II, and he essentially defected to the communist Chinese side. So you're not going to see a book like this basically anywhere outside of China, because Israel Epstein, if he hasn't been completely forgotten in most places outside of China, he's probably been rejected as a traitor, which I guess you could say he was. But I I bought this here in Beijing mostly because I think it's just really interesting to hear a perspective that you don't normally hear, that of a very sympathetic American who came to China and was, from what I understand, the first foreigner to get People's Republic of China citizenship after the revolution. So yeah, it's interesting, and of course it's called the People's War. So this is going to be his work as a war correspondent. Of course, he was very sympathetic, but it should still be a little bit more neutral than maybe his later writings would probably be. I haven't read it yet. I just recently picked it up, but it looks interesting, I think. Okay. So now we have Records of the Historian by Sima Qian. This is a Chinese edition, but it is in English. I can't read Chinese, unfortunately. Um, so in China, they had a tradition in pre-modern times of what were called the canonical histories, or the 14 histories. And the records of the Grand Historian, or in this case, just records of the historian, was the first of those. Essentially, when a new dynasty took power, uh, an office would be assigned the responsibility of writing the history of the previous dynasty. This one being the first one, it writes from the mythological dynasties that supposedly started the whole system up to, I believe, the year um, maybe something like 1000 BC or something like that. Um, this is, of course, as you can probably tell from how small it is, a highly abridged version of it, probably a highly simplified version of it, but there's not a lot of this material available in English, so I'll take what I can get. My understanding is that there is currently an academic translation project of uh, the work that this is an abridgment of, that is hopefully going to have a full English translation available quite soon. I'm looking forward to that, but until then, I'll take what I can get. So, good. Okay. Here we have The River's Tale, A Year on the River by Edward A. Gargan. So this is a travelogue of a year traveling down the Yangtze River from Tibet to or not the Yangtze, excuse me, the Mekong River from Tibet to its mouth in Vietnam. It is a highly critical travelogue. I'm frankly surprised that he got away with some of the things he got away with saying here. And it's a really great one, though. It's fantastic. It's very evocative of all the cultures that exist along the river. Again, from Tibet to Myanmar to Southwest China to Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And he he is obviously very sympathetic to the people living there, but he's highly critical of the governments and regimes living there, which is something I love. I really appreciated that. So it's a great travelogue, definitely worth reading. Um, I know this is one that you can get on Amazon, but I have not been able to find a digital copy, so I still have it in my no backups section of my bookshelf. Okay, here we have The Road to Wanting by Windy La Yun. Windy La Yun is a Myanmar or Burmese author. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing her family name, but I haven't read this one. I don't know very much about it, except that Wanting is a town. It's not just saying the road to Wanting as in the English word wanting. Um, and that it's about well, my understanding is that it's about a young Burmese woman seeking a better life in the big city, or possibly after immigrating. Like I said, I haven't read it yet. Looking forward to it. Looks interesting. Okay. Here we have Si Pandin, also known as Four Rains. This is by Kukrit Pramod. This is actually book one. I don't know how many books there are of this because I just got it at a used bookstore in Bangkok. But I've looked this up online, and apparently this is regarded as the classic novel of Thai literature. So I'm looking forward to it. It's told from the perspective of a what's called a minor wife. So in pre-modern Thailand, when people were allowed to have multiple wives, there would be one major wife and then several minor wives. So this is definitely told from an outsider point of view. but it's still told from the point of view of someone who is an outsider in a noble family. So it's going to be kind of an interesting look at the lives of Thai nobility. I imagine, and again, this one is also one that I haven't read yet, but I am imagining that it's going to be a bit soap opera-ish, but that can be fun too. So looks good. Okay. Here we have Siamese Melting Pot, Ethnic Minorities in the Making of Bangkok by Edward Van Roy. This one is, again, it's an academic text. It's an academic historical text about, as the name suggests, ethnic minorities in Bangkok. This is something that I think a lot of Westerners are not aware of, how diverse so many of these Asian countries are, how many interesting minority ethnicities and minority cultures exist here. So this is definitely something that you should pick up if you're interested in Thailand at all. If you're traveling there, very much worth it. Pick it up. Okay. Here. Some short stories from Mongolia. That's what it says on the tin. This is a collection of short stories by Mongolian authors. It was published in Ulaanbaatar in the 1980s. So this was a communist era publication. And as such, the book or the stories inside do definitely toe the party line. So that might be a turnoff for some people. For me, I think there's value in looking at that kind of material as well. And just, I mean, look at it. How many times are you going to find something like this? This is exactly the kind of unique, special books that I want to have on my bookshelf. Okay. Here we have Travels in Upper Laos and Siam with an account of the Chinese Ha invasion and Puan resistance by Pines. Pines was a French explorer and diplomat who set out from Annam, which is what's now basically central and southern Vietnam, up into Laos with the goal of expanding French claims and French influence on the region and pushing back against British influence. So this is his travelogue of his adventures on that expedition, and it's White Lotus Press is a press a publishing house in Thailand that has a lot of these kind of colonial era travelogues from Southeast Asia, and they're all really interesting. And I wish I had more of them because you can't find these very often. And this one, at least, is beautifully illustrated. It's got a lot of the original woodcut prints, a lot of these beautiful hand-drawn maps. It's really a fascinating book. Yeah. We have the Vintage Book of Latin American Stories. I picked this up while traveling around South America, and I could not be more happy that I did. I think short stories are probably the best travel books, in my opinion, because you can dip into it. If you're on a bus for a couple of hours, you can read a short story from the region and get a feel for the country in a way that you can't by reading a travelogue, because travelogues show you what people saw, but they show you what people saw from an outsider's point of view. And there's value to that. That's good. Don't get me wrong. I just told you how much I liked the travelogue. But having the voice of the people from that country is definitely interesting to me. And finally, this is the book that I am currently reading. This is Yawar Fiesta by Jose Maria Arguedas. This is the same author as Deep Rivers, which I mentioned near the beginning of this video. So this one, it's a very interesting book on the politics of race relations in early 20th century Peru. The relationship between the primarily white, solid citizens of the town of Puquio, as well as the Cholos, which are essentially the mestizo people, and the Indios, the Indians or indigenous people, and how the basically political controversies make strange bedfellows in this book. So you have the indigenous people kind of teaming up with one of the great solid citizens to preserve the traditional bullfight, and at the same time, the liberal students who left the town from the mestizo and Indian communities and went to university in Lima, teaming up with the central government who wants to destroy this tradition because they see it as a dangerous, exploitative tradition. So it's kind of interesting to see this kind of dynamic going on of, um, you know, like I said, strange bedfellows. It's an interesting book. I'm not sure how successful the translation is, but I'm having fun with it. So I'll probably finish it in a day or two. Um, that's going to be my next video, is talking a little bit more in depth about Yawar Fiesta after I finish it. So I will see you soon. If you are interested in this kind of content, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will try to keep going with it. Okay. If not, I'll probably still try to keep going with it because it seems like a nice hobby. So see you later. Have a good day. Talk to you next time.